We all know the common meme about Latin America in alternate history. Nothing ever happens. During World War II, most Latin American nations remained neutral, before slowly, at least officially, siding with the Allies. But aside from Brazil sending some men to Europe and Mexico performing minor roles in the Pacific, their participation was mainly economic and diplomatic. But while most of the South American continent would lean towards the Allies during the conflict, mainly due to economic ties to Britain and America, in the very south of the continent, Argentina and Chile remained open to the Axis, facilitating routes for German officials to flee Europe after the war. Now interestingly, it wasn't like South America was some liberal, democratic paradise. Only Uruguay could be classified as a solid democracy, as most were corrupt or flawed democracies, dictatorships, or military juntas. On paper, these authoritarian regimes might have a lot in common with the Axis powers of Europe. Yet, during the war, none would actually side with them. But the nation with perhaps the greatest potential to join the Axis was Argentina. More than any other nation in Latin America, they stubbornly refused American demands to cut ties with the Axis powers. And across the war, they remained the propaganda headquarters of the German Reich in the region. This, though, made me wonder the question: what if Argentina had actually taken the step to join the Axis powers? But if you're interested in such naval conflicts, why not fight them for yourself in World of Warships? The game is currently running a limited time event to commemorate the 80-year anniversary of D-Day, the Allied landings on the Normandy beaches, adding new ships, special missions, historical commanders, and skins to the game. With some of the best and largest naval battles you can find in gaming, there is something for everyone here. There is a big selection of historical warships and commanders to lead your fleet. There are more than 40 maps to play in, with special historical missions, as well as exciting player versus player combat. And don't worry about what you're playing it on, the game is completely free. Not just on PC, but on PlayStation and Xbox as well. By using my link and the code DDAY80th, you will get 200 doubloons, 7 days of premium time, 1,000,000 credits, a choice of a variety of great ships, and 3 limited time D-Day missions. So, what are you waiting for? Go down there and start playing. Now obviously, this is a lot more difficult than you might imagine. Even when Germany looked dominant in Europe, within Latin America, Argentina would be fighting on their own. Sure, they might be able to quickly occupy Britain's Falkland Islands. It is after this that the issues start to arise. As long as America remains at least partially opposed to the Axis and Britain's trading influence remains to be felt, Argentina is definitely not getting any other allies on the continent. Sure, they are officially part of the Axis, but for all intents and purposes, they are fighting a completely separate conflict. So, for Argentina to really join the war, we need to satisfy 2 conditions. First, we need to have a world situation where joining the Axis might look tempting. Basically, we need to insert a decent hope for a quick conquest of the Falklands, hopefully while Britain is so distracted they will just ignore it. This fact is relatively easy to accomplish. We can have Argentina join right after Germany's conquest of France, while England starts being under serious bombardment and Axis domination over Europe starts to look inevitable. Under these conditions, we might forgive Argentine leaders for assuming that the Falklands are not quite a priority for Britain. Now secondly, we need Argentine leadership willing to pull the trigger. The official president of the time, Roberto Ortiz, is not the man for the job. He would even ban some pro-Axis organizations from Argentina and is definitely not joining them in the war. Now luckily for us, he would fall ill, and the acting president instead became Ramon Castillo. Castillo wouldn't declare war on Britain either, but importantly, he would face a military coup in 1943. In the previous decades, Argentine politics had become extremely corrupt, and elite subversion of elections were simply a known fact. By 1943, the army had had enough and considered the time right for a coup d'etat. During this tumultuous period, we might find a figure willing to declare war. Now, for this to coincide with Britain looking weak and America not yet being in the war, we need to move up the coup a little bit. Have the corruption be more rampant, have them clamp down on the military maybe, and have an alternate coup occur in 1939 or 1940. After the coup, Argentina faced a rotating door of military leaders for the rest of World War II. What I propose here is that one of these military leaders, in a bid to solidify the legitimacy of the new regime, seeing the weakness of Britain in Europe, decides upon an invasion of the Islas Malvinas, the Falkland Islands. Now, in our timeline, the Falklands were uneventful during World War II. Out of fear of a Japanese invasion, yes, really, Britain did install a garrison on the island in 1942. In 1940 though, with British ships busy defending the home islands and no garrison present on the island, it is not crazy that Argentina could occupy the islands. After this military operation, they offer peace to Britain, offering to resume much-needed food shipments to Britain. But did they ever underestimate Churchill, Prime Minister at this time? Sure, Britain has more important fronts to focus on for now, but there is no way that Churchill signs peace, and he remains outraged. For now though, Argentina remains on the islands, thinking themselves the victor. But towards the end of 1941, this changes, as Japan strikes the United States. With the war now escalating into a truly global conflict, Argentina is in trouble. In our timeline, despite Argentine ties to the Axis, Britain was the one that remained on friendly terms with them, relying on Argentine food imports. The Americans, though, were not quite as forgiving, announcing embargoes, sanctioning Argentine companies, and, allegedly, though this is unproven, even holding talks with the leader of Brazil about a potential invasion of Argentina. And remember, all of this while Argentina was still neutral. So, as America enters the war in this timeline, Britain and America begin to put pressure on Brazil. In exchange for Western money and aid, they wouldn't be hard to convince to join the war against their main rival, occupying some border territories and potentially starting to level Buenos Aires into the ground. Brazilian, British and American ships start imposing a blockade on Argentina. Of all of their neighbors, only Chile is somewhat sympathetic to Argentina, but they don't even come close to considering joining the war. They had only 50 years ago gained this territory from Bolivia and Peru, and joining any war now would only give them the perfect excuse to settle old disputes. For the West, Argentina remains a side theater, and Brazil isn't strong enough to overrun the nation themselves. Instead, slowly but steadily, pressure starts mounting on the Argentines. Their leadership seeks a limited surrender, but the Allies demand unconditional. By around 1944, Argentine resistance crumbles, and the nation is occupied by America, Britain, and Brazil. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but if you've come this far, consider subscribing. I release videos like this every single week, and I'm sure you'll enjoy those too. Now, the rest of the war has barely changed from all of this. It is not like Britain and America will use many resources destined for other fronts on Argentina, and the main post-war lines would likely not have changed. Argentina, though, would have been. Territorially, Brazil might gain some minor territories if they want to from this conflict, and Bolivia had lost these territories only 50 years ago and might regain some of them as well. But a larger partition of Argentina I consider unlikely. Politically though, Argentina would have changed significantly. First, their claim to the Falkland is enshrined in their constitution, and Britain would demand that this be removed. Beyond that, Britain had a number of unequal treaties giving them influence over Argentina's economy, primarily the meat sector. Britain would attempt to reinstate those treaties, but America would attempt to get Britain to back down over the issue. The Cold War had just begun, and ideological lines were being drawn. This would lead to both West Germany and Japan to be rebuilt as strong American allies, and Argentina would take a similar place in American thinking. Sure, we all know about American influence in Latin American politics already, but Argentina was unique. Rather than just backing a coup attempt or a dictator, America could now mold the nation into the strongest US ally in the region. So, what does this mean? Well, that's difficult to say in detail. It would be very hard to pinpoint which factions the US promotes in the nation. So let's instead focus on the fact that it isn't this guy, Juan Perón. Perón was a member of the Argentine military and would likely be removed after the war. In our timeline, it was Juan Perón's Argentina that allowed many high-ranking Germans to flee from Europe to Latin America. And during the war, Perón would have been vocal about his support for the Germans. Why does this matter? Because Juan Perón is the single most important person in modern Argentine history. His brand of politics, Peronism, led Argentina into being a neutral nation during the Cold War. His economic policies were also interesting. He was a big promoter of autarky or self-sufficiency for Argentina. In itself, it is not a bad thing for a nation to be able to rely on itself, but it can be taken too far. The government used heavy subsidies to promote companies and industries, investing heavily to produce things that could have easily been imported. Beyond that, many Argentine companies, shielded from foreign competition, started falling behind their competitors in innovation. Both of these issues would start to gradually weaken the Argentine economy over time. Now, aside from that, the Argentine people enjoyed a broad welfare state, with great standards of living for their income. Universities were paid for by the government, workers' rights were approved upon, and various other benefits were had. Yet, this would eventually come with significant issues as well. By some point, 25% of the Argentine population relied on a government income. Now, at the end of the day, Peronism cannot be fully defined as good or bad, especially when considering it from the perspective of 1946 rather than using our modern hindsight, but it cannot be denied that a lot of Argentina's modern problems have been a result of adherence to Perón's political leaning. Thus, removing him from the timeline, as we do here, is a big change for Argentina. Now, even with American influence, I imagine that Argentina will become more left-wing than America is, but compared to the Argentina of our timeline, they would be much further to the right. Now, without any details, it is impossible to say for certain whether this would be better for Argentina. But they do have a couple of things going for them now. They would receive some form of Marshall aid in rebuilding their economy, and it is very possible that long-term, Argentina's economy performs much better. Also, a very important side note, without Perón's Argentina, we have a good chance of capturing more German war criminals, which can only be a good thing. Now, zooming out from Argentina, little has changed in terms of the Cold War except from one key event. The Falklands War would no longer occur. In our timeline, I can forgive Argentina for thinking that Britain might just let the loss of the mostly pointless rocks go. But such a thought would be ludicrous in this alternate timeline. Argentina's claim to the islands would be removed from the constitution, and in further treaties with Britain and America, this fact would be confirmed. Of course, technically Argentina can always just reassert their claim later, but the Falklands position within the British Empire and conscience has changed. In our timeline, the only core British territory occupied were the Channel Islands. But in this timeline, the Falklands would be added to this list. The idea that Britain will just give up on this territory now is crazy. And internationally, Argentina would also find little sympathy, as the world would see a former Axis nation restarting a World War II era conflict. And I doubt that even the Soviets would diplomatically support such an Argentine action, leaving Argentina alone and isolated if they tried. But I hear you think, you're talking about the Falkland Wars, but who cares? Well, it matters because of this lady, Margaret Thatcher, one of the most significant British politicians of all time. Taking office in 1979, she was in power for 11 years, while her party held on for another 7. That's 18 years of conservative rule, which would fundamentally change the nation. Thatcherism was introduced and entrenched. The British economy was fundamentally reformed. Key industries were privatized. The government was centralized. Trade unions were weakened, and the welfare state was to a large extent dismantled. Economic growth and small government became priority number one. Now, by itself, these would have been big reforms for any government to make. But perhaps even bigger was her effect on Labour, the main, supposedly leftist, opposition party. After 18 years of conservative domination, Tony Blair would fundamentally reform the Labour Party, rebranding it to New Labour. With this move, Labour basically let go of most of their traditional leftist stances, accepting Thatcher's reform as the new status quo, no longer being committed to trying to reverse them, bringing the two main parties in Britain far closer together. Now, this big tangent is relevant because Thatcher was the Prime Minister of the nation during the Falklands War. Before this conflict, across her first term, the popularity of her and the Tories was on the decline. Britain had entered a recession, unemployment was high, and the Tories were polling as the weakest of the three parties. But everything changed when Argentina attacked. Thatcher's swift response in handling the crisis, as well as an economic recovery, would endear her to the public, leading to Thatcher winning an absolute majority in the UK Parliament. Without the Falklands War, this likely wouldn't happen. Now, considering the economic recovery of 1983 and the fact that Thatcher could delay the election until 1984 if she wants to, I still expect the Conservatives to get a victory. Most important though is the SPD Liberal Alliance. In recent years, the Labour Party had shifted further to the left than ever, while Thatcher was seen as extremely right-wing. This would lead to the alliance to be a decent third-party choice. Again, as mentioned, once polling to become the largest of the three parties. While I doubt that they could actually accomplish this fact, the main opposition party would not be a crazy title to accomplish. Due to the way British elections work, they might still be undercut in terms of actual seats, despite a higher vote share, as they had broad support throughout the nation rather than focusing on specific areas, but still, this result would make huge differences in the timeline. The Conservatives would be denied a majority in this election, meaning support from the SPD Liberal Alliance would be needed to govern. Now, an important ramification of this is the commitment of the alliance to proportional representation within Britain. I mean, just look at the differences in percentage of votes and the amount of seats gained. Britain's district system is very flawed, and with Thatcher's government lacking the majority, she would either need to back the alliance's demand for proportional representation, or Thatcherism would be implemented in a far lesser way, as anything radical that Thatcher wants to do needs approval from either Labour, very unlikely considering their leftism, or the centrist SPD Liberals. Thatcher is therefore far less of a looming figure over modern Britain, while in elections going forward, Britain might just move towards a three-party system, and depending on the alliance's leverage, Britain might even achieve proportional representation somewhere in the 90s. Britain's modern fate has been completely changed, all because Argentina decided to invade the Falklands in 1940. But before you go, remember to check out World of Warships from the link in the description and use the code DDAY80th to claim your free reward. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom one is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching and goodbye.